This is OSP 322, and we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic today on SharePoint hybrid solutions, which means making the best of both worlds, which is SharePoint Online and SharePoint on-premises. Just a quick introduction. My name is Shyam Narayan, and I'm a premier field engineer with Microsoft based out of Melbourne. I've worked very closely with our customers, helping them build and operate solutions on top of SharePoint, Windows Azure, and the .NET stack. Before we get into it, just a quick show of hands. How many of us have had a play with SharePoint Online? Okay, keep your hands up if you've had a serious play with it. Okay, a few. And who's had a play with hybrid? Oh, excellent, you've come to the right session. So the key objectives and session takeaways for the session is I'm hoping that at the end of the session, you're able to have a discussion with your customers, your partners, and internally within your organization on what SharePoint Hybrid brings to the table. And more importantly, how do you build and deploy hybrid workloads on top of SharePoint? And I'm hoping to leave you with two key takeaways. Firstly, giving you a good run through the concepts, configuration, and infrastructure requirements to deploy hybrid SharePoint. And then how do you make hybrid search a reality? Just a quick note, this is a level 300 session, so we are going to keep a fairly technical flavor throughout. However, for a couple of slides in between, I will be diving a bit deeper, say a level 400, to show you some of the under-the-hood interactions to take away some of the voodoo away from hybrid solutions. So with that, let's get into it. When working with my customers, I keep getting asked this question, what is hybrid? So what's hybrid in SharePoint? A hybrid solution is one in which you have a SharePoint Online tenancy, a SharePoint 2013 on-premises farm, which are wired together in a way that they can consume services and workloads across both environments. In the 2013 release, we've got Business Connectivity Services, or BCS, Duet Enterprise, which is the SAP integration workload, and Search, which support hybridization. I like to think of hybrid SharePoint as this elastic scale, or elastic capability that allows you to scale out SharePoint to the cloud or the other way around. Now, when we look at SharePoint 2010, the previous version, we could have something that I like to call as side-by-side deployments. So you could have a SharePoint 2010 farm on-premises, you could have a SharePoint Online tenancy, and the only integration you got was the sign-in experience using single sign-on and identity federation. However, with 2013, this integration is much more native to greatly enhance the information worker experience. So we have expanded it more from just sign-in through to workloads and services that SharePoint has to offer. Now, when we deploy a hybrid solution, there is a little bit of planning involved. There's a little bit of work involved to get it up and running. So the obvious question is, why should I go down the path of hybrid? What does hybrid give me? Or what are the core value propositions that hybrid brings to the table so I can actually explain this to my technical decision makers? I reflected a lot while putting this specific slide together, and I can say there were quite a few good factors to go down the path of hybrid, but I've managed to distill it down to 3 core factors. Firstly, it enables what I call migration to the cloud. I have a lot of discussions with my customer where I've come across a lot of factors which impede migration to the cloud. Factors such as full trust code, which can take time to be ported over to the new cloud app model. Factors such as integration with line of business systems and services, which cannot be published out to the internet. And I've also come across regulatory and compliance-specific reasons which may prevent you from going to the cloud. Again, with hybrid, you can pick and choose which workloads you offload to the cloud and still have an on-premises presence for workloads that cannot move. It also greatly reduces what I call the time to market. With SharePoint Online, we're releasing features into the online version on a regular basis, which means information workers can start using these features straight away. IT no longer are the bottleneck. Where on the flip side, from an IT perspective, you now have the time to plan out on-premises upgrades and take the time out rather than getting pressurized by the business. So it's a win-win for both parties. And finally, by offloading workloads to the cloud, you are reducing the burden on internal IT teams. By moving services to the cloud, you naturally tend to have a slimmer on-premises deployment, which means lower number of servers you got to manage, lower number of servers you need to patch, which inadvertently leads to reducing your data backup sizes, helping you achieve your internal SLAs at much comfortable manner. It also frees up IT to actually go to start delivering the value-added services rather than focusing on just keeping SharePoint running on-prem. So what does it take to start deploying hybrid? So when you start off the journey, the hybrid journey, there is one key factor we start off with, which is selecting the right topology or deployment model for our hybrid solutions. And currently, we have 3 models that are available. And each of these topologies or deployment model enables certain workloads and also have some constraints attached with them. So when you deploy, you need to pick one of these models to get started with. And the key thing to notice is that you're not locking yourself into that deployment. It is flexible enough for you to change the topology as new requirements come to surface. So what are the 3 topologies? The first one is what I call as one-way outbound hybrid topology. So in this case, the on-premises 2013 farm is allowed to connect to the SharePoint Online tenancy. So SharePoint on-premises farm, in case of search, queries the SharePoint Online service. From a deployment perspective, this is the most straightforward and most commonly seen deployment out in the wild. However, the only workload supported is search. The second model is what we call as the inverse of this, or one-way inbound topology. In this case, SharePoint Online is allowed to connect to your on-premises SharePoint farm via a reverse proxy. This probably involves a bit more of configuration at the reverse proxy side, and also we need some additional certificates to get this going. Again, the only service or workload that's supported is search. Finally, we have what we call as two-way hybrid, which is a combination of the previous 2 topologies, in which both SharePoint Online and the SharePoint 2013 on-premises server are allowed to talk to each other. So it's bidirectional flow. And in this case, we support all workloads, including BCS, SAP, the SAP integration, and search. So let's now spend the rest of the session looking at hybrid search and how do we get it going. Before I continue, any questions around the topology before I jump into hybrid search? OK, we'll get going. One key thing to notice, or one key thing that we have to go through when we are deploying any hybrid workload is 3 phases. So it's a 3-phased approach to deploying any hybrid workload. The first 2 workloads or phases are common for all workloads. No matter what service or workload you're deploying, the first 2 phases have to be done. And the second phase, or the third phase, sorry, is very workload specific. So this is where you would configure either search or hybrid, depending on which workload you're deploying. The first phase consists of getting your hybrid infrastructure ready and prepped for a deployment. This is where you would acquire servers, configure DNS, and make sure the hybrid infrastructure is ready. The second step is probably the most involved out of all 3, involves getting the identity and security around your hybrid infrastructure ready. So this is where we actually set up trust between the 2 environments. Once this is done, we are ready to move on to our specific workload deployment, and in our case, that's going to be search. If you are doing BCS, you would still do the first 2 steps and then move over to BCS. And also a good thing is once you've deployed one of the workloads, adding an additional workload is relatively a straightforward process. So what does hybrid infrastructure consist of? What do we need to do to get the hybrid infrastructure ready? And this is the key thing, key stage to kick off hybrid deployment. There are something what I would call as basic requirements for a hybrid solution. We need to have our domain registered as a public, within the public internet space. So we need to have a publicly routable domain. And you need to have access to DNS records for this domain. And I'll tell you why in a moment. If we are configuring what we call as one-way inbound, so SharePoint Online talking back to your on-premises environment, or two-way, we also need to add an A record to resolve your on-premises farm from the internet. If you are not doing the inbound scenario, you wouldn't do that step. So I got asterisks in there which denotes specifically steps that you would do for an inbound or two-way hybrid scenario. We need identity federation configured and single sign-on working. This is a key requirement for hybrid deployment. We also need to acquire 2 certificates to get hybrid up and running. The first one is what we call as the STS certificate. Does anyone know what STS is? Yep, you got one hand. So it's the security token service within SharePoint. So what happens is when we deploy SharePoint on premises, we actually install and configure a certificate which is used to validate security tokens on premises. However, in a hybrid scenario, Windows Azure Active Directory, or ACS, becomes the token signing service, and it needs to use the same on-premises certificate. But the default certificate that gets installed on your on-premises farm is not supported in Windows Azure Active Directory due to the trust chain. So we either need to acquire an X509 self-signed certificate or a certificate from a root authority. The second certificate is one which you would acquire if you were configuring one-way inbound or two-way hybrid. And this is what we call as a secure communication channel certificate. So this is a certificate used by SharePoint Online to secure its communications to your on-prem services. It's also used by SharePoint Online to perform certificate authentication with your on-premises reverse proxy. And it's also used by SharePoint Online to verify connections to your on-premises farm. But there is one key factor with this certificate. This, again, needs to be an X509 certificate. However, this time it needs to be issued by a root authority. It cannot be a self-signed or a domain-issued certificate. So you need to go to someone like VeriSign or Baltimore to get a root certificate from a root authority. If you're doing an inbound or two-way hybrid scenario, we would move into configuring SharePoint Online. If you were doing an outbound scenario, you can pretty much skip the second phase. From a SharePoint Online perspective, what we're going to be doing is configuring a target application within the secure store service in the cloud and configuring it to use the secure channel certificate that we acquired in the previous step. We will use that certificate to authenticate to the on-premises systems. You also need to deploy a reverse proxy, upload the same secure channel certificate to the reverse proxy to perform certificate authentication to ensure that SharePoint Online can actually authenticate successfully. This is a question that I keep getting asked a lot, and there has been a bit of guidance put around that. Currently, Microsoft Threat Management Gateway, or TMG, is the only reverse proxy that has got guidance published on TechEd. However, we are working on putting content out for more proxies in the future. So just I've got some links in the end of the session which point you to these resources. It doesn't mean that other reverse proxies are not supported. We've actually specified what are the requirements for these reverse proxies, and many of the reverse proxies out in the industry actually support them. OK, once we are done with SharePoint Online, we are back on premises configuring our SharePoint 2013 farm on premises. We need to configure 3 service applications. The first one is the user profile service application. This, again, is a key step in our configuration. We need user profile service app up and running, and it should be configured to synchronize local Active Directory users and groups. And the reason for this is because in a hybrid scenario, when a federated user accesses resources, the STS service actually queries the user profile service to get more information about the user. And I'll show you this in an architectural slide, what I mean by this. So it's very, very crucial that we have user profile service up and running. And if you remember, during the basic requirements, I spoke to you about having federation and directory synchronization running. It's for the same reason, but within the cloud. We also need the application management service, which is a new service application in SharePoint 2013, and the subscription setting service up and running. These are pretty straightforward to deploy, and we rely on these services to register SharePoint Online as an app within SharePoint on premises. We would then deploy a primary web application on our 2013 farm, create site collections, create a search center in our case, and if we are doing the two-way hybrid, we would actually publish it out over the internet using the reverse proxy. So if you remember, I spoke to you about registering an A record. So this is the record that would identify our on-premises farm from the internet. So what does this look like? How does this, at the end of phase 1, how should my infrastructure look like? This is just a representation of what your infrastructure should look like at the end of phase 1. First, we should have an Office 365 subscription and a SharePoint Online tenancy. So Office and SharePoint Online tenancy will be underpinned by what we call as Azure Active Directory. Just before I continue, how many of you know what Azure Active Directory is? Okay, we got a few hands. We've got a lot of people who are not familiar with this. So I'm just going to digress a bit and actually tell you what Azure Active Directory is. So to tell you that, we need to look back at the start of Office 365. When we were building Office 365, there was a need for this core directory up in the cloud that would run against SharePoint Online, Lync, and Exchange Online. We wanted this directory to be what we call as, wanted it to be multi-tenanted. We wanted it to operate at what we call as internet scale. We got 125 million users on Office 365 that needs to operate at that scale. And to solve the problem, what we did was we actually built a new directory up in the cloud and shipped it alongside of Office 365. We never gave it a name. A lot of people called it Microsoft Online Directory Service, but it was never given a proper name until last year, when we actually shipped the same directory now as a service within Azure and renamed it as Windows Azure Active Directory. So this core directory is now not only used by Office 365, but also other Microsoft services such as Windows Intune, CRM Online, and also the Windows Azure portal itself is relying on the Azure Active Directory. You can also build applications that actually integrate with the same directory. Moving on, getting back to SharePoint. When you get a SharePoint Online tenancy, you automatically are provisioned a root site collection and what we call as a search center. What you need to ensure is any users who are going to be accessing resources in a shared environment have been given permissions to access those sites. We would also have the secure channel certificate uploaded to the secure store and a new target app created. We would have a reverse proxy deployed, and the same certificate has been uploaded to the reverse proxy so that SharePoint Online and the reverse proxy can do certificate authentication. From an identity perspective, we would have our federation scenario deployed. You can use any of the supported federation servers. In my case, I've got ADFS server showing you ADFS, and you would be directly synchronizing users up to the cloud. Within the SharePoint 2013 farm, you would have the user profile service application deployed. It would be synchronizing users from Active Directory. You would also have the app management and the subscription setting service deployed. Finally, you would have a primary web application that hosts your site collection. If you were going to publish this over the internet, you also needed to configure any host names or alternate access mappings so it can actually be available on the internet. So what does this look like? What does this hybrid infrastructure look like? Let's just go have a look at what my infrastructure looks like at deployment. So again, just quickly, a lot of this configuration takes time to run, especially DNS propagation. So I've got I would say, my infrastructure mostly built. So I'm going to show you what it should look like after the deployment. Let's come up. I'm just going to fire up Internet Explorer and get into the Office 365 administration portal. I'm going to use a form filler here so you don't save you see me type. And the first thing I'm going to focus on is the users and groups and the domains. So like I said, we need a public internet domain registered. So in this case, I do have my private domain registered with Office 365, and I have it configured to perform what I would call a single sign-on and directory synchronization. It's basically Office 365 telling me that you are configured for single sign-on. And a key step during this process, this is why I said you need to have ownership to the domain, is because Office 365 will challenge you to prove ownership. So you need someone in the organization who actually has access to the DNS records. Once that's done, we're going to go back and look at the users that have been synchronized from my on-premises directory. Okay. Let's see, in this case, I've got Adam Barr, and his username is in an UPN format, adambarr@slurray.com, and he's actually synced with my local Active Directory. So we actually need any user who's going to be accessing this resource in a federated scenario, sitting in the cloud, and should have a user profile both on premises and behind the scenes. Because you're synchronizing the user, the SharePoint Online's user profile service app will also create profiles for them, which you don't see, but it gets done behind the scene. And that's why we require users and the security groups they belong to be synchronized up to the cloud. In a scenario like search, where we actually give you back security-trimmed results, if we do not have this information, we can't give you the correct results. You might be incorrectly denied access to resources. Does you see a question there? No. In this case, I also have groups, security groups from my on-premises environment synchronized, and I've got the group membership coming through as well. And this is a key step for you to validate that this has come through. Otherwise, you're going to run into very weird search results coming back. Once that's done, let's just jump into SharePoint. Give it a sec while the site collections load. There you go. And those are the two site collections that needs to be deployed. The first one is what we call as your root site collection. So that's the address that the on-premises farm actually connects to. So when we go and configure hybrid search later down in the session, we'll be actually providing it that URL. And that's the search center that users would be going within SharePoint Online to execute queries. So what you need to ensure is users who are going to be accessing these resources have been given access to these sites in the cloud. Finally, we need to create a new secure store target app to configure it for certificate authentication. I'm going to call it secure channel, and give it my global admin permissions. And this is what we need to change. By default, secure store is configured to use Windows Auth. So we actually need to change it to ensure we can perform certificate authentication. So I'm just going to go change that, get rid of the default values, and type in certificate, change the field to certificate, and change the second value to certificate password, and similarly set the value. I'm going to change that. Certificate password. I'm going to give it a few users who can actually administer this app, and which users have their credentials actually mapped, so which users can actually use this target app to perform authentication. Once that app's configured, what we need to now do is actually set the certificate. This is where I would upload in this case, a wildcard certificate issued by a root authority and configure it with the target app. So in this case, I do have a certificate issued by a root authority. It's a wildcard certificate that I've acquired previously. I'm going to upload that, give it the password. And with that, we're pretty much done configuring SharePoint Online. We'll come back to this app later on in the session, but from a basic configuration, that's all we need to do from a SharePoint Online perspective. Let's now go back to our on-premises environment. In this case, I've got a SharePoint farm running. It's a 2-server farm. And we've got the app management, and the subscription setting, service application deployed and configured. This is a pretty straightforward deployment, doesn't require any additional configuration. In addition to that, we also have the user profile service app configured. It's configured to synchronize users and groups. And at the moment, I've got 12 users synchronized or available in my service application. Need to ensure that the user who's accessing a resource has a profile within this user profile service application. If not, you're going to get a 401 unauthorized when you go look through your ULS logs, and the user won't be able to access resources in a hybrid environment. So if you are running into issues, the first thing you want to come check is, does the user have a service profile, a profile in the service application, and has he or she been synchronized to the cloud? In addition to that, I also have a web application, just a simple web application deployed, and I've configured an alternate access mapping on that, which results to my public internet domain. In this case, SharePoint.snarray.com would be the internet address that an end user would be consuming, or SharePoint Online would use to connect back to your on-premises farm. Finally, also I want to show you a certificate that I've generated. So this is a certificate that I'm going to replace. So this is a self-signed certificate that I've created, which I'm going to use to replace my on-premises SharePoint Farms STS certificate in the next phase. Just another quick thing that I want to point out is the validity of the certificate. So this is a self-signed certificate, so it's generally valid for a year. You need to ensure that if your certificates are configured for expiring after a year, you have some process of catching the expiry and updating the cert, because if not, you're going to end up with a broken solution. And that's something you don't want. So you want to make sure that you don't update certificates after the fact and have some process of actually capturing that in some system and updating it beforehand. Any questions before I flick back to the demo, to the slides? Yep, question there. Yes, you can. Yep, you can. If you come down, I'll show you how to do that once you come. So the question was, can you use a vanity domain for Office 365? By default, a SharePoint address would be your subscription name.sharepoint.com. You can add vanity domains to that now. OK, moving on. Now, this is probably the most involved of all phases. And this is the level 400 I was talking about. It's going to come up soon. In this phase is where we configure the trust between the two servers, the two farms, to achieve something called as server-to-server authentication. Okay, I'm going to warn you, this slide is a pretty verbose slide, and I've done it for a reason. I want you guys to have this slide deck after the session, after the party, and when you want to think about hybrid, you have a set of points that you can get to very quickly, rather than going and looking it up on the internet. So what are the 7 key steps we need to perform to achieve server-to-server authentication? The first thing we do is we replace the STS certificate on all servers within our on-premises SharePoint farm. So if you have a 10-server farm, we need to replace the STS certificate on all servers. So this is the certificate I showed you within IIS that I've generated as a self-signed cert. You need to replace it. The second step involves installing certain configuration tools on one of your SharePoint servers in the farm. This server also needs to have access to the internet. Okay? You need to install what we call as the Microsoft Online Sign-In Assistant, the Windows Azure Active Directory Management module, and the SharePoint Online PowerShell module. If you have configured ADFS or Federation, you already would have installed one of these, couple of these installers during that phase. Next, we actually take the on-premises STS certificate and its private key and associate that with what we call as the app principal for SharePoint Online within Azure Active Directory. So this is what allows SharePoint Online to validate security tokens coming from your on-premises environment, because there are 2 separate environments. By moving the certificate along with the private key, any signed security token coming from the on-premises environment will be validated by SharePoint Online. You do this using PowerShell, and I'll show you that. Next, you need to add what we call as a service principal name for your public domain. And it's in the format of a special GUID, which I'll talk about, preceding by what we call as a wildcard host entry for your domain name. So if your domain is contoso.com, you need to add a SPN which says star.contoso.com. And the reason you add a wildcard entry is because in the future, if you do decide to change your host, so rather than going from sharepoint.contoso.com, you want to fail over to, for example, sharepoint.dr.contoso.com, you don't need to go change all this config because it's a wildcard entry. It's a blanket cover for your domain. We then register the SharePoint Online application principal with our on-premises farm as a trusted app. In this case, we're going the other way. We're telling SharePoint on-premises that SharePoint Online is a trusted app. So anything that it sends you, trust it. And again, certain certificates get exchanged. So when SharePoint Online sends you a token, you can validate that on-premises. We then set what we call as the authentication realm for your on-premises environment to the same authentication realm of SharePoint Online. So every time you, like I said, you get an Azure Active Directory instance, so that's got a unique identifier. So you basically set both SharePoint Online, which gets done automatically, and you match that on premises. So you're basically saying now authentication, app authentication on my on-premises is going to happen within this scope. Finally, we configure what we call as a Azure Active Directory or ACS proxy on our farm, and then register what we call as a security token issuer. So what we do, we basically tell SharePoint on premises that Azure Active Directory is going to be the new token signing service, and it's going to give you a certificate which you can use to validate tokens coming from SharePoint Online. So I'm going to walk you through a PowerShell script quickly, and I'm also going to make it available online, so you can actually go through that in your own time. Any questions? I know this is a bit abstract. Any questions? I'll walk you through an architectural diagram where I show you how this configuration gets applied. Any questions? OK, moving on. So this is where we left off at phase 1. The first thing we need to do with phase 2 is we replace the STS certificate on premises. We pick that certificate along with this private key and upload that to SharePoint Online. So the trust has been set up. We then went and registered an SPN, so you can verify connections to the on-premises web application. We registered the SharePoint Online tenant as an app within our on-premises farm. We then went and deployed the Azure Active Directory or ACS proxy and configured it to be a new token service, token signing service. Now, this is why this configuration, you do it for this reason. I'm just going to walk you through what happens behind the scene and why it is server-to-server authentication. When a user executes an hybrid search request in SharePoint, that user isn't interactively logging on to the remote farm. What SharePoint does, in this case, either SharePoint Online or SharePoint on premises, it makes a call on behalf of the user to the remote service. And hence, we call it server-to-server authentication. There isn't an interactive logon with the remote service. So once we have the proxy deployed, what happens is when a user makes a request, the local STS service passes certain user credentials to the Azure Active Directory service, and it gets back an OAuth token. Because we have exchange certificate, that signed token can be validated on premises, and you know it's from the trusted issuer. And then the OAuth token, along with the user credential, is sent as a header in subsequent requests to the remote farm. Because we have signed it with the same OAuth token that we got back, the remote STS service can validate that and allow access to the remote farm. In this case, especially in case of search, we are using the client-side object model to actually make these calls. If you do want to see what's happening behind the scenes, or if you're troubleshooting something, I would recommend dialing up the verbosity of ULS logging and executing search. You can actually see this entire process going through. Similarly, if you have a user who's logged on to SharePoint Online, so this is the other scenario. You've got a user who's executing a search on SharePoint Online. What SharePoint does is it tries to perform certificate authentication with your on-premises farm. And if that succeeds, it makes a request to your on-premises site collection. Again, in this case, it's going to pass through a security token, which the local STS service is going to pick up, go back to your user profile service application and reconstruct the user object. Because in this case, the user is logged on to SharePoint Online. We're just sending through a token. Generally, it's the UPN claim, so whatever at domain.com. We use that details to rehydrate the user so that we have a security construct within an on-premises farm, and then we can perform security-trimmed search results and send it back to SharePoint Online, which will then finally render it out to the user. So you can see there's a lot going on in here. If you have any questions, please do come up, and we'll talk about this after the session. So let's just go see how do we get all this configured, and what does an environment look like at the end of phase 2. So phase 2, pretty much, you're going to be spending most of your time in PowerShell land. So what I'm just going to fire up my remote machine. And I've got a couple of PowerShell scripts. Okay, the first one is pretty much the step 1 of our tasks. We replace the STS certificate using the commandlet set SPS token service config, and we give it the new certificate that we've generated. We also add that certificate to the local certificate store, and this needs to be repeated on all servers in your farm. Once that's done, we would have gone ahead and then installed the tooling, the additional tools. And the reason you do that is because you don't want to be jumping between servers when you're configuring this. So I actually have those tools installed, and what I'm going to be doing is just importing these modules into my PowerShell window. And it's pretty much the online integration and SharePoint Online PowerShell commandlets. Once that's done, I'm going to go ahead and connect to my remote service, which is SharePoint Online in this case, and log on with a global administrator for SharePoint Online. So it's going to prompt me in a second for credentials. I'm going to log in with my global administrator for SharePoint Online, or the Office 365 tenancy. Hopefully I've got my password correct. And while we wait for that, we just go look at some parameters that we've configured. So we need to configure 3 or 4 parameters up front, which are going to be used throughout the scripts. I'll just walk you through what these parameters are. The first one is what we call as the wildcard entry for your domain. This is what you would use in the future to configure your SPN. We get the root site collection for our on-premises farm. We will use this to configure trust. And then we hit a really interesting GUID. I have a hard-coded GUID in here. Does anyone know what this GUID is? Okay, I would have been worried if you knew what this GUID was. Okay, this represents the SharePoint Online's application principal ID. And the reason I've hard-coded it is because it's going to be the same no matter which Office 365 or SharePoint tenancy you're using. So it's an application principal. It's a global ID for the SharePoint Online farm. So no matter which tenancy you're working with, everyone in this room, if they go ahead and try to configure hybrid, you will be specifying the same ID. And then you also get what we call as the object ID for your company, which is nothing but the unique identifier of your Azure Active Directory tenancy. We then create a metadata endpoint, which allows us to configure the trust without specifying a lot of details. And I'll show you what this looks like. Let's just make sure we're connected in. Yep, it's all connected. That's good. I'm just going to go ahead and execute this. And while that's running, we'll look at the next piece of configuration. Next, what we do is we actually pick up the STS certificate, okay, along with its private key, and add that to SharePoint Online's application principal. So this is done at the level of an Azure Active Directory. So this is where we are saying, here is my on-premises certificate. This is what I'm going to use to sign my security tokens. Please use this value to decrypt the tokens when I send it across the wire. So this is how SharePoint Online starts to trust tokens coming from your on-premises environment. It's done using the new MSOL service principal credential commandlet. Just make sure that's gone through. Yep, that's gone through. And I've actually said this previously on my environment, so I'm just going to do a validation step to show you something interesting. If you remember when I showed you the certificate within IIS, it had certain expiry dates. So that's the same expiry for that credential. That's why I said you need to keep in mind that if that certificate expires, you basically don't have auth credentials for the remote service. Once that's done, you go ahead and set the SPN. So I've actually set the SPN. I'll show you what that looks like. So it's basically a string. It's basically a string that's concatenated with the SharePoint Online's ID, along with a wildcard entry for your domain. So if you see the first entry in here, that's the SPN you need to add. So just concatenate a string and add that to the SPN object. And the first bit of that string, that one, that's again the app ID for SharePoint Online. Finally, we set the authentication realm to that of SharePoint, that of Azure Active Directory, and then we finally go ahead and actually configure the actual ACS proxy, and then register the Azure Active Directory service as a local security signing certificate, security token issuer. So when a user logs on, you will still go to a trusted identity issuer. That's when an interactive user logs on. But however, when an app interaction or a remote interaction happens, this token issuer will be invoked to get security tokens from. So basically what will happen is if a user executes search, before we make the client-side object model, we will actually call out to Azure Active Directory to get back a signed token. I'm just going to go get that and show you what that needs to look like. And what we need to see here is the registered issuer name. And you need to get back, again, a string. That's the app ID, separated by an @ sign, followed by our Azure Active Directory ID. This is automatically wired up for you. You don't need to actually configure these things. And the reason for that is because if you remember, I told you about the metadata endpoint. That actually provides SharePoint all the information required when we actually configure the issuer. So if I just go into Internet Explorer, paste that in. Oh, didn't get it, 1 sec. Just come back with the text file, which is nothing, which would contain what we call as JSON data or JavaScript object notation data. And this has got the same issuer specified in it. So you don't need to manually configure these things, but these are just validation steps to make sure everything's working as expected. This is, in a normal configuration, you generally wouldn't be going into this level. As long as the commands have executed successfully, you pretty much would carry on. If something isn't working, these would be the steps you would be using to actually troubleshoot that deployment. Once that's done, if you jump back into SharePoint and go into the actual service applications, you would see that we would have a proxy sitting at the bottom, the ACS proxy, or the Azure Active Directory proxy. And more importantly, under security, trust, we have the ACS service. So this is the Azure Active Directory service in the cloud being registered as a trusted security token issuer. Once we have done this, we're pretty much ready to configure hybrid search or any of the workload. This probably is the most complicated of all configurations. Once this is done, we are pretty much ready to move into configuring hybrid search deployments. So what does hybrid search deployments consist of? And this is probably the easier out of all the configuration. You can look at configuring search, hybrid search, into two main phases. Firstly, you would configure something called as a result source. So result sources are new to SharePoint 2013. And you can think of them as an evolution of what we had as federation location or scopes in the previous version. One of the new features that result sources allows us to add is configure a remote SharePoint location that we would be querying. And the word query is very important over here, because with a hybrid deployment, we are not crawling or indexing the remote farm. All we are doing is consuming results or querying the remote index. So in this case, SharePoint Online and SharePoint on-premises are crawling content locally, and the remote farms then talk to each other to query those indexes. So we don't ever directly index the content in the remote farm. In the case of outbound search, what you would be doing is configuring the root site collection for SharePoint Online as the target location. And inversely, if you're configuring inbound or hybrid, two-way hybrid, you would be configuring the root site collection for your on-premises farm as the remote location. The result source also allows you to configure authentication. So when you're on premises, you pretty much pick default authentication. So whatever SharePoint is configured to authenticate, it would use that. However, in SharePoint Online, you would configure it to use the target application so that it can actually perform certificate authentication. So if you remember, in phase 1, we created a target app within SharePoint Online. We would be providing the same app within the result source. The next thing we need to configure is something called as query rules. Again, query rules are new to SharePoint 2013, and it allows us, or allows SharePoint, to take certain actions based on the intent of the query. In our case, we wanted to go query the remote farm based on certain conditions. It allows a very flexible configuration option, because we had to make this available in the cloud and on premises. So a site owner or a site collection administrator or a farm administrator can actually configure it at different levels in the hierarchy. You can configure a query rule at a site level, at a site collection level, or globally within a service application and make it available to all consuming web apps. Query rules are constructed of 3 key elements. We have something called as the query condition. When do you want this query rule to fire? You can actually say, if a user puts in a specific term, go fire this query rule. This is very useful when you want to have a targeted search experience. You have something called as a query condition, or query action, sorry. What do you do when the results come back? How do you want to present these results back to the end user? And then finally, publishing options. You can actually control the availability of this query, say, make it available between a time frame, if you have some promotions running, very, very popular in e-commerce scenario, or you can just make it active and inactive based on what you're trying to do internally. This is very, you would use the publishing options more in e-commerce or content publishing scenarios. You wouldn't use them a lot in your standard hybrid scenario. So let's go have a look at how this configuration looks and look at the demo of how we can actually query across both servers. I'm going to flick back to my machine. Just look at how we're doing. It's good. Okay, the first thing I'm going to be doing is actually I've configured a search service application on this farm previously. Generally, it takes a bit of a while to actually get a service app up and running, especially the search service one. And we're going to be spending most of our time in here, querying or setting up query rules and result sources. First thing, I'm going to go in, create a new result source. So let's call it SPO. And I'm going to pick remote SharePoint. This is what I was saying. Result sources allows us to configure a SharePoint farm to talk to a remote SharePoint farm. And you have the same option available in SharePoint Online as well. Because I'm sitting within an on-premises farm, I'm actually going to provide my SharePoint Online's root site collection. So that's what I had configured as my root site collection in SharePoint Online. So I'm going to provide it with that value. Okay. And then have an option to either just query for standard SharePoint results or execute people search. And then finally, I have an option over here to pick what kind of authentication I want to provide. I'm sitting on premises, you always pick default. When you're configuring the other way, that is SharePoint Online trying to talk back to your on-premises farm, you would actually pick the SSO option and give it the ID of the secure store service created previously. I'm just going to hit save on that. Okay. And now we go ahead to create a query rule. So what I'm going to do in this case is actually create a query rule that fires when a user executes a search against any content in SharePoint. I'm going to say, fire this query rule when a user executes a standard search in SharePoint. And that is what we call as local SharePoint results. So I'm just going to say, every time a user executes a local SharePoint results, I want this query rule to fire. I'm going to pick that first. Yeah. You can see out of the box, SharePoint ships with a few query rules. So this is what Microsoft have shipped out of the box. So the experience you get when you create a search center is actually driven by these query rules. What I'm going to do, I'm going to create a new query rule. Let's call it online service. And configure it with certain conditions. You need to set the context. I'm going to say, execute this query or query rule every time someone executes a query against any source in SharePoint. So I'm going to pick all sources. If you pick the second one, you're going to be scoped just to that scope. You also have options to actually tie it to what we call as the managed metadata store if you want to do user segmenting or tie it to categories. So if you want to control a very, very tightly controlled search experience, you would go down the path of actually tying it to your corporate taxonomy. The next thing you would be configuring is what we call as the conditions. When do you want this query to fire? So if you think your queries are going to be too noisy, you can actually put in conditions saying when someone searches for the term online, so for example, Word document online, fire this query. Or someone puts in an action word like downloading, download. You can actually say, pick that word. If that's the thing, then go execute my query. It's a very, very controlled and personalized search experience. However, to keep things simple in our case, I'm just going to say remove the condition, fire no matter what the user types in. And then we come into displaying the search results. How do you want to display it? So I'm going to say in this case, I want to create something called as a result block. Okay? How many of you are familiar with best bets and promoted results in SharePoint 2010? Yeah. So this is, again, an evolution from that. I'm going to pick a result block because I want what I like to call as a sledgehammer approach. No matter what, put it at the top. I'm going to say, call this as results from SharePoint Online. However, in this case, I'm going to say, just query my online service. This is the result source I'd created in the previous step. I'm going to say, in this case, just query my online service. I better pick that. And say, show me 3 items. And what I want to do is, I want to give the end user an option to say, here are the top results from SharePoint Online, but also there is this link over here, which allows you to go browse the entire result set. So just for the sake of convenience, I've actually created that page previously, again, on my on-premises farm, and it's got a token which says, execute a query with the same, what was typed in the search box. So I'm going to copy that URL. And then I'm going to say, no matter what, put this result block at the top of my result set. Because if the results aren't very relevant, sometimes the result block will not get shown. Or if highly relevant results come back from your on-premises environment, for the sake of the demo, it may be on the 5th page or 6th page. To avoid that, what I'm going to do in this case is say, no matter what, put the result block up at the top. Go OK. And then finally, we have the publishing option, which allows me to either mark it as active or inactive. What I'm going to do before I actually mark this as active is log in as a federated user. So I'm actually logged in as the admin. I'm going to log in as Adam in this case, because we saw he was a federated user. Okay, so that's the search center on my on-premises SharePoint farm. So it's a local search center. Okay. Adam goes and executes a wildcard search, give me back everything. Okay, this is just the out of the box. I haven't activated hybrid search yet. You can see I'm just getting results back from my local farm. In this case, you can see it's coming back. All local farm, which is what you would expect on an on-premises search. What I'm now going to go and do is actually hit save on the query rule. Okay. Takes a few seconds for it to actually register on the back end. And hopefully, when I now execute my search again, we start seeing the remote results as well. It's taking some time, because in this case, it's actually trying to talk to SharePoint Online, hydrate the user, go through all the token exchanges. And what you would see in this case now, at the top, we have a result block bringing me results from my SharePoint Online tenancy. So from an end user's perspective, one single search center, I've executed a wildcard search. It's gone out to SharePoint Online and my local SharePoint farm and brought me back results. This is the more link I configured. So I can say I want to actually go to show me more from this result source. And what you would see is, in this case, I am only getting back results, again, from SharePoint Online. And I'm still within my on-premises farm. I still haven't left. The user hasn't been moved or been redirected to a SharePoint Online tenancy. I'm still sitting within my on-premises farm. From an end user's perspective, he or she doesn't even know that they're seeing results from a remote source. They can also directly go to the online option and execute a search there. Or go back to everything. I'll just tailor this a bit more tighter. And you can see in this case, I'm getting back Word documents that are sitting in my SharePoint Online tenancy, and Word documents coming back from my on-premises farm. All the standard refinements that are used to continue to work with the hybrid scenario as well. This is what we call as one-way outbound. I had a colleague of mine who's an escalation engineer on SharePoint Online. He was lucky enough to give me an environment with the proxy configured. So we also have two-way hybrid configured for another tenant. And what I'm going to do is actually log into a SharePoint Online tenancy. So big shout out to Manas, who actually helped me set this up. And I'm going to log in with an SharePoint Online account. I'm going to go hit search. Also, I want to log into my admin portal and show you a couple of settings. The first thing I want to show you is how we have configured the result sources and query rules within SharePoint Online now. I'm going to go use the search option. And within SharePoint Online, we have the same option to configure query rules and result sources. In this case, my result source, I got SharePoint on-prem. Spin in. OK, there you go. And I've actually configured it to actually go back to an on-premises SharePoint farm. So this is actually published via a reverse proxy out onto the internet. And as discussed before, we actually configured it to use a target app that we've created. If I jump in to Secure Store, I would see the same target app being configured. So it's already been configured. We have a certificate uploaded, and we're configuring SharePoint Online to use that. Now, if I jump back into my SharePoint Online search portal and execute a wildcard search, what should be happening behind the scenes at the moment is SharePoint Online is actually talking back to your on-premises farm, executing a remote search results on it, and again bringing you back results within your SharePoint Online tenancy. And as you can see in this case, I've actually gone back to my on-premises farm, executed a search, I also have executed a search locally within my SharePoint Online tenancy. In this case, we've got hybrid going both ways. A user can either log on directly to their SharePoint Online tenancy and execute a search, and they're going to get results back from both sources, or can log on to their on-premises farm and execute a search and get the results. Question?
Yeah, if you didn't have the result block, would the results be merged in the same result set from the two indexes, essentially?
No, because we won't be able to do that because the relevance across two indexes are different. So what you would be doing in that case is like I created a specific vertical.
You still need to have sort of the two web parts.
Yes. Yes. So there's no additional web part, so it's just one web part that you drop, the core search results web part, and the result block automatically shows up. But you wouldn't be able to merge the results because the relevance ranking would be skewed. So just repeating the question. The question was, if we didn't have the result block, can we have the results merged across both result set? And the answer is no, because we can't have, because both indexes would have a different relevance ranking. So when I search for data in the cloud may be totally different to a result set that I get back on-prem. So we can't merge the result set. So you need to go down what we call a targeted vertical, like what I've created in this case, an online vertical, or you would use the result block feature. It's going to show you, search for some other term. Okay, got hybrid. In this case, I've got a text document that's showing up within my online tenancy. I'm just going to click on that. It's nothing but a, okay. It's brought me back a document. Similarly, if I do log on to my on-premises farm, so this is the same farm that I was using to connect to from SharePoint Online, and go execute hybrid. I should get back the same document. It's two-way hybrid in this case. In this case, you can see I've actually brought back results from a SharePoint Online farm. So this is how we would configure and expect a two-way hybrid to work. So with that, just wrapping up, what did we cover today? We went through a lot of configuration, but I'm hoping that you've got a sense for what hybrid workloads in SharePoint looks and feels like, what are the configuration required, and hopefully you're going to go home and try this. You got some appreciation of the identity requirements, which probably is the key to hybrid. The hybrid infrastructure and the workload configuration are pretty much straightforward if you've got your identity piece right. And then we looked at configuring hybrid search. There are a few sessions that are on this week which actually talk about identity within Office 365. There's a session by Paul Andrew, who's a product manager from Redmond, who owns the identity stack for Office 365. So if you haven't been to his session, please do go online and watch the session on Channel 9. I think, if I'm not sure when his session is on, I think it's on this afternoon. So if you do get a chance, please go to that session. I also have resources for the session, including step-by-step instructions on how to actually go through all these phases. We published it out on TechEd, so I've got those articles linked in here. And I also want to say we are constantly updating this content on TechEd. So on a weekly basis, when I went and checked last week, we had published and had an update to some of the configuration. So as we are coming up with new information, we are constantly updating this. Again, I'm pretty sure you would have seen this slide a few times by now, but I do want to take some time out over here and say, please do provide your feedback. So Jeff, the content owner, and Ben Walters, who owns the SharePoint track, really look into these feedback to see how we can make this event better next year. And you may also win a Sculpt mouse. Channel 9, how many of you are familiar with Channel 9 MSDN? Okay, so this is an awesome resource. We have videos from all TechEds across the world published out over there. So if you've never been to an overseas TechEd or haven't seen the TechEds from previous years, we have all content along with the videos put up on that. So please do go to Channel 9 MSDN and look up the videos. So have you been to the Office Showcase? I know someone tweeted yesterday that they won a ride on this flight, so please go down, come, I'll be around, and I've got a few of my colleagues who will be around the Office Showcase. Please come talk to us, and we'll try and answer any questions that you've got. And with that, I'll open it up to any questions. So if I'm getting the question right, does it matter if Active Directory has federated services installed? We need it to be installed. Without that, we can't continue with the deployment. So it needs to be. It's a prerequisite. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Any other questions?
With the certificate,
Yep.
if that expires, if it expires before you get to it, you can't fix it.
OK, so the question is, with the certificate expiry, if the certificate expires before you get to it, yes, you can fix it. The only issue is you're going to have a user experience issue in this case. Yeah. So you can fix it. It's just a user experience issue. The question is self-signed certificate. You can use it for your outbound search scenarios. For inbound search, you need a root certificate issued by a root authority. So generally, if you've configured what we call as federation, you would have already acquired a wildcard certificate for that domain. You can use the same one. That's what I've used in my environment.
Is there any way to test some of this stuff out with we've got a 2010 tenant still? So can we hook that up to our 2013 on-premise environment in any way?
Unfortunately, no. So if you really want to test it out, I would say it's just spin up a 2013 tenant. I think a 30-day trial. That's what I'm using in this case, a 30-day trial to test it out. But do you know when the upgrades have been planned for your tenant?
We're on the backside of the Microsoft.
Oh, OK. So, any other questions? OK. Thanks, guys, for coming. And hopefully have a good TechEd and enjoy the party.